Chapter 1. The Empire of Eternity. It was said throughout the Empire that the Thorn dynasty had never truly begun, because it had never truly ended. Its roots stretched back not merely millions of years, but into ordered ages, whose calendars had long since been superseded by new chronologies. Where other ruling houses rose and fell in the twists and turns of history, Thorn had become a constant, an axis around which the political, the military, and, ultimately, the physical world itself revolved. That this was regarded as myth was part of its power, for every legend that spoke of immortality overlooked the very essence of the matter. The Thorns had not received immortality as a gift, but had built it as an infrastructure. The Empire of Eternity, as it was known in official documents, was not merely a confederation of worlds, but a system of interdependencies, treaties, shared energy grids, and controlled possibilities. An invisible web stretched between the thousands of inhabited planets, the artificial habitat spheres, and the converted gas giants, a web that had become as self-evident as gravity once was. Anyone living in the Thorn Empire grew up with the certainty that hunger was a historical anecdote, illness a malfunction from a barbaric age, and death, if it occurred at all, a conscious decision or an accident of cosmic rarity. Yet it was precisely this sense of normality that made the Thorn dynasty the most powerful family in the Milky Way. It controlled not just territory, it controlled normality. At the root of this normality lay a promise that had been renewed time and again across generations: order through foresight. The Thorns had learnt that a galaxy is not ruled by decrees, but by time, by long, patient periods in which every rebellion grows weary, every enemy grows old into compromise, every crisis seems manageable if one only looks far enough ahead. The first Thorns had elevated the art of forecasting and resource management to a state religion. Later, when humanity no longer regarded the Kardashev scale as a theoretical exercise, but as a strategic roadmap, they turned this religion into a science. And when they had finally become a Type 3 civilization, when entire stars hummed in Dyson swarms and black holes were no longer a source of terror but power stations, science became the pure administration of the unimaginable. The management of the unimaginable had a home: Asterion, the central planet of the Empire. Asterion was no paradise in the romantic sense of the word, no unspoilt garden. It was a work of art comprising continents shaped to meet climatic and cultural needs, and cities that were not grown but composed. One saw no random streets there. One saw patterns, fractals, as clear from an orbital perspective as a mathematical formula. In the upper atmospheric layers, rings of platforms circled, and in the deepest layers of the planet, the resonance cores worked to stabilize the flow of energy into the imperial networks. Anyone who set foot on Asterion sensed immediately. This was not merely a capital city. This was proof that the Thorns regarded matter itself as negotiable. The heart of Asterion was the citadel of time, a complex of towers and domes in which government, military, and science were not housed in separate buildings, but on interlocking levels. No artwork hung in its halls by chance. Every painting, every sculpture, every holographic projection served a purpose: remembrance, warning, legitimization. Particularly famous was the Gallery of Names, a long corridor whose walls were not made of stone, but of densely packed data crystals. Anyone walking along it could, if they wished, hear the voices of Thorns who had lived centuries ago, explaining their decisions, admitting their mistakes, or recording their victories in cool, detached words. It was not nostalgia. It was a military resource, experience, preserved and accessible, as if time were an archive cabinet. Every major decision began in this gallery, even if it was later carried out in council chambers, fleet command centers, or the chronophysics laboratories. The Thorn dynasty had understood that power is not sustained by fear alone. Fear is loud, but short-lived. Lasting rule arises from reliability, from the feeling that the hand at the wheel does not tremble. That is why the Thorns rarely displayed their strength as a threat. They displayed it as stability. When a border system in the outer arm of the Milky Way was threatened by pirates, it was not just a fleet that appeared. A supply corridor appeared, bringing trade and security at the same time. When a world cried out for autonomy, it was not immediately offered chains, but rather a stake in the empire, technical upgrades, and seats on regional councils. And if a rebellion flared up nonetheless, what many only whispered behind closed doors came to pass. The Thorn dynasty had ways of ending conflicts before they had even begun. Some of these paths were visible and celebrated in parades. The Order of the Starfleets, with their mighty carrier ships, their gravimetric lances and planetary shield generators, was the shining face of the Empire. In the inner systems, there were children who could draw the silhouette of a Thorn cruiser before they had learnt to write. Yet the true backbone of the dynasty was less spectacular: information sovereignty. Quantum entanglement had made faster-than-light communication a commonplace affair, but the networks that carried it, the protocols that secured it, and the nodes that set priorities were under imperial control. Whoever controlled the network controlled not only messages, but response times. And in an empire stretching across thousands of light-years, response time was synonymous with destiny. The Thorns also had a habit that was regarded as arrogance by the less powerful houses. They took personal responsibility. Whilst other dynasties hid behind councils of regents, the Thorns traveled to trouble spots, inspected fleets, visited research stations, and spoke with governors. Not out of sentimentality, but out of a dynastic principle. Those who rule must be seen. Visibility was a form of contract. On Asterion, it was said that emperors of other eras had scarcely ever left the palace. Elias Thorn, however, the current emperor, had earned a reputation that was both reassuring and unsettling. He was present. Not everywhere, for no one could be everywhere, but at the points that mattered. He appeared at the right moment, asked the right questions, and did not accept empty platitudes as answers. Some therefore called him a reformer, others a controller, and still others a man who lived with the burden of eternity as if it were a weight upon his shoulders. And yet even Elias was merely the current face of a structure older than any individual. The Thorn dynasty had founded its power not solely on bloodlines, but on training, bonds, and trials. The family's children did not grow up in a gilded cage, but in a labyrinth of expectations. They learnt diplomacy, as one might learn a foreign language, and strategy as one might learn mathematics. They saw the maps of the galaxy not as constellations, but as a web of needs, resources, and risks. And they were accustomed from an early age to the fact that private desires rarely remain private in an empire. Loyalty was not a word one swore, but a habit practiced daily. At the heart of this dynastic education lay a realization that was soberly articulated in the official chronicles. Immortality amplifies everything. It amplifies love, because it grants time. It amplifies hatred, because it need not fade. It amplifies mistakes, because they do not end of their own accord. The Thorns had therefore not turned immortality into an invitation to debauchery, but rather an obligation to discipline. It went without saying that not everyone in the empire regarded this as a virtue. In the borderlands, stories circulated of a family that lived forever and therefore ruled forever, as if that were the natural order of things. In the shadow markets, people whispered of data erasures, of vanished dissidents, of worlds that suddenly had a different governor and could no longer remember why. Whether these stories were true was less important than the fact that they were believed. Belief is a second reality, and in a Type 3 civilization, reality itself is malleable. That was precisely why the Thorn dynasty observed its rituals so scrupulously. Whenever a major new project was decided upon, such as diverting a stellar current to a more distant region, or constructing a node gate on the border of a zone not yet fully mapped, it was not merely a matter for technical committees. It took place in the presence of the family, in the light of the gallery of names, as if to prove to the ancestors that one remained worthy of them. They called it the chain. Every thorn was a link, and every link bore the weight of those that came before. According to the chroniclers, the empire depended on this cycle, not on the ships, not on the Dyson swarms, not on the quantum nodes. These things were tools, interchangeable over long periods of time. What mattered was that there was a family that claimed to oversee the whole, and that billions, indeed trillions, of people accepted this claim because it gave them something that was rare in a galaxy full of possibilities: direction. When word spread that the Galactic Council was to convene once more, it was little more than a blip in the daily newsfeed in the inner systems. In the outer worlds, however, where the starfleets were not a constant presence and culture was based more on improvisation than on planning, it was interpreted as a sign of the times. When the council convened, it meant that decisions were pending which were significant enough to set even Asterion in motion. Decisions in which Emperor Elias Thorn would act not merely as a ruler, but as a symbol. The power of the Thorn dynasty was most evident in moments like these, not in loud triumph, but in the quiet certainty that the galaxy, whether it wanted to or not, would align itself with them. And somewhere in the halls of the Citadel of Time, amidst the voices of the ancestors and the soft hum of the data crystals, the next question, the one every eternity asks, was already waiting. How long can order endure before it becomes a threat? Those who awoke in the inner districts of Asterion rarely did so, gazing upon a sky that was truly a sky. The clouds were often deliberately arranged. The twilight followed a curve devised jointly by psychologists and climatologists, and even the wind sometimes carried a barely perceptible blend of ionization and scent, so that the city breathed like a living being. Many regarded this as a luxury. In truth, it was a reminder of how far humanity had reached out, without yet feeling the grip. Type 3, it was said, was not merely a figure on the Kardashev scale. Type 3 was a way of life, a state in which energy was no longer conceived of as a resource, but as the fundamental essence of civilization. In the past, empires had drawn borders on maps. The Thorn Empire drew borders through rivers of power, through networks of photons, gravity, and curved space-time. The question was no longer, who owns this system? It was, who prioritizes this node when 10,000 worlds need something at the same time? The visible symbol of this prioritization lay not on a single planet, but in the space between the stars. Dyson swarms, millions of self-organizing collectors, orbited suns like a second, artificial radiation field. From a distance, they looked like shimmering rings of dust. Up close, they were cities, factories, temples of thermodynamics. They captured the light, breaking it down into work, into information, into motion. Added to this were the resonance cores deep within Asterion, which did not generate energy, but smoothed it out, just as a heartbeat smooths out blood pressure so that a body does not tremble. And yet, even that was merely one aspect of the whole. For humanity had learnt that stars were not the only power stations in the universe. At the edges of the Milky Way lay the so-called dark wells, black holes with stabilized accretion disks and controlled Hawking radiation. In the past, they would have been regarded as graves, as places where everything vanished. In the Thorn Empire, they were power stations. Matter was dropped in, energy was extracted, and care was taken to ensure that nothing simply vanished. Not even that. That was the technical side. The other was the cultural side, and it was more dangerous because it was silent. In a Type 3 civilization, the unimaginable became commonplace, and the ordinary is the greatest enemy of wonder. Children on the fringes of civilization only learnt the names of old diseases because their teachers used them as examples of historical errors, much as people used to speak of superstition. Plague, cancer, dementia. All these words had a fairy tale quality, as if they came from a time when people had still been afraid of their own bodies. Aging was no longer a fate, but a choice that, in rare cases, was actively maintained out of tradition or philosophical conviction. Most chose against it, not out of cowardice, but because the society around them had long been designed for the long term. Relationships, projects, entire worldviews were calculated to last for centuries. The result was a strange calm that, from the outside, appeared to be peace. Those who did not have to die had time to savor conflicts, to drag out compromises, to preserve enmities like wines in cellars. The Thorn dynasty knew this. That is why it had made discipline a duty and memory an infrastructure, as the gallery of names proved. They preserved not only decisions, but the reasons behind them, so that eternity would not become repetition. In the Empire's administrative archives, there was a saying that was never uttered aloud in the presence of officials, but which everyone knew. Type 3 is not power. Type 3 is responsibility on a galactic scale. Most uttered it mockingly, as if it were propaganda. Yet the technicians working on the network stabilizers and the navigators calculating in hyper-relativistic corridors took it seriously. They knew how quickly a tiny miscalibration could turn into a stellar conflagration. For the tools were not merely large, they were precise. Faster-than-light communication via quantum entanglement had become a mundane process, as they said in the inner systems. But mundane did not mean simple. It merely meant that the complexity had become invisible. In the Citadel of Time, there were levels dedicated solely to the quantum protocol, halls full of node cores that did not transmit like old radio sets, but managed states, maintained correlations, and set priorities. Whoever controlled the network controlled not only messages, but synchrony. And in a civilization spread across thousands of light years, synchrony was what had once been community. If a shield generator failed on a world in the Perseus Arm, a supply shipment could be dispatched from a completely different system in the very same second. A repair team could be sent out, and a fleet could make a slight adjustment to its course. Not because anyone reacted quickly, but because the imperial pulse connected the empire like a nervous system. Asterion was the brain, but not the only one. Regional hub cities, orbital rings, artificial moons, all these were ganglia of a body that had learnt to be vast without becoming sluggish. But this acceleration came at a price. It made decisions more final. In the past, an order might have fallen on deaf ears, been misunderstood, or lost its force due to delays along the way. In the Thorn Empire, an order arrived before doubts had time to settle at a safe distance. That is why politics in a Type 3 civilization was less a struggle for information than for ethics. Not what is possible, but what must be possible immediately. This question arose wherever one worked with space-time itself. In the research zones at the edge of Asterion's lunar orbits, where chronophysics deployed its sensitive measuring arrays, people no longer spoke of propulsion in the classical sense. They spoke of tolerances in causality, of corridors in which time did not merely pass, but was negotiated. The existence of the tempest drive was no secret in academic circles, but its application remained a subject that was discussed in official channels only in metaphors, not because they feared the public, but because they knew how quickly certainties could be overturned if one tampered with their foundations. Type 3 had also transformed warfare, so much so that most inhabitants of the Empire knew war only as an image. The order of the starfleets was omnipresent in stories, in parades, in the silhouettes children drew. Yet the true power lay not in fire, but in the threat of control. Gravimetric lances capable of shifting trajectories, shield nets that enveloped entire planets like gleaming shells, and the ability to isolate a system's energy networks in a matter of minutes. One did not need to destroy to win. It was enough to strip away the normality that the Thorn dynasty administered so perfectly. That is why peace in the Empire was rarely the result of trust. It was the result of predictability. People knew that hunger remained a historical footnote as long as the networks were running, that diseases would not return as long as the medical swarms did their work, that death remained a choice as long as accidents were kept cosmically rare. These promises were not sentimental. They were contracts. And like any contract, they had clauses that were forgotten in everyday life. In the outlying regions, where improvised cultures thrived in the gaps of the vast system, Type 3 was something else entirely. Not a part of everyday life, but a distant flash of lightning. The imperial freight routes were seen as lines of light in the sky, not made up of constellations, but of geometries designed for eyes meant to find solace in them. The supply windows were received as if they were gifts, and yet mistrust grew. For whoever could give so much could also take it away. The stories of vanished dissidents, of data erasures, of worlds that suddenly had a different governor and could no longer remember why, found the most fertile ground in such regions. Whether they were true or not was almost secondary. They were a response of human instinct to a reality that was too smooth. Asterion was aware of this. In the upper layers of the atmosphere, where the platform rings orbited, there were observation gardens from which one could not see the Empire, but could feel it. A member of the Thorn family would sometimes stand there, incognito enough not to trigger a ceremony immediately, yet never truly invisible. Elias Thorn rarely did this in public, yet his reputation for presence was well-founded. He had understood that. Type 3 was not merely a level to be ascended. It was a summit, a ridge from which every direction was possible. On the one hand lay an order so stable that it translated the chaos of the universe into administrative records. On the other lay the abyss of a hubris that no longer realized when it had declared itself a law of nature. In the gallery of names, there were voices that had warned against precisely this. Ancient emperors, whose words flowed from data crystals, had spoken of times when one no longer saw one's own tools as tools, but as an extension of the self. And when technology becomes the self, then every boundary becomes an insult. Perhaps that had been the most fundamental difference between Type 2 and Type 3. Not the amount of energy, not the size of the fleets, not even the range of communication, but the fact that, with Type 3, people began to view the universe as malleable, not in individual projects, but as a fundamental attitude. Matter negotiable, time archivable, death optional. Those who lived this way could very easily forget that even eternity has its conditions. As word of the Galactic Council spread, There was little discussion in the inner systems about what it actually meant. People merely wondered which decisions would seep into the daily stream this time, which new nodes would be built, which routes optimized, and which systems would be elevated to the rank of a core world. But beneath the surface, in the areas where technicians stayed late in their laboratories at night and fleet officers checked their charts a second time, there was another suspicion. If the Council was convening, it was not because the Empire wanted to expand, but because it stood at a boundary that could not be drawn on a map. Type 3 was the turning point because it raised the question that every power eventually asks, and which in the Thorn Empire only grew louder, never quieter. If you can do anything, what stops you from doing everything? It was in this question that the real threat lay. Not in an external fleet, not in a rebellion, not in a pirate hideout on the fringes, but in the quiet, seductive logic of omnipotence. And that is precisely why it was no coincidence that the Citadel of Time seemed somewhat more unsettled these days, as if even the resonance cores deep within Asterion had shifted their rhythm ever so slightly. As if the gallery of names, that military resource of preserved experience, were whispering a little louder. The galaxy aligned itself with Thorn. Yet at the apex, a single decision could be enough to turn destiny into direction. When the Citadel of Time began to feel more unsettled, it was not something one would find reported in the official news feeds. In the internal systems, there were no headlines that openly spoke of nervousness. Instead, small things shifted. Priorities in the quantum protocols were reweighted, as if someone had fine-tuned the synchronization by a few tenths of a degree. In the corridors of the Citadel, the movement patterns of the security drones changed, barely visible, but to those who lived there as conspicuous as an altered heartbeat. And above Asterion, in the upper atmospheric layers where the platform rings circled, additional lights glided by. Arrivals. The Galactic Council was not a democratic assembly in the traditional sense, nor a parliament drawn from the people. It was rather an instrument that the Thorn dynasty had honed over centuries until it was precise enough not only to govern a galaxy, but to keep it functioning in harmony. Officially, it was a forum of the worlds, a stage for consensus. Unofficially, it was a mirror reflecting just how stable the normality administered by the Thorns really was. When the representatives of thousands of systems came to Asterion, they did not come to learn what was possible. They came to negotiate what should be deemed necessary. The journey itself was a spectacle. In the outer anchorage zones of the Asterion system, corridors opened up, cutting through space like invisible locks. Ships did not appear as shooting stars, but as events. First, a minimal distortion in the background field, then the clear geometry of Imperial navigation signatures, and finally the hulls of the delegation cruisers, escorted by smaller units of the Order of the Starfleets. The largest of these carried no visible weapons, and that was precisely the message. Those who came here were protected, but also held. Asterion granted hospitality, yet it did so within a framework it defined itself. These days, there were more people than usual in the observation gardens of the platform rings, even though there was no official occasion. They could be seen amongst the carefully arranged plants, which came from dozens of biospheres, and on the glass walkways that filtered the air so cleanly it almost smelled of emptiness. Some wanted to see the arrivals, others simply the feeling of being part of a moment greater than any single planet. Above them, a delegation fleet from the Perseus Arm passed by, its hull covered by an ornamental-looking matrix that was constantly reconfiguring itself. An aesthetic statement, one thought, or an encryption protocol so complex that it feigned beauty. Meanwhile, within the Citadel of Time, a hall had been activated that was rarely used. the Hall of Knots. It was not located on the grand upper levels, where marble and light translated power into familiar forms, but deeper down, closer to the resonance cores, where one could feel the hum of energy smoothing in one's bones if one stood still long enough. The hall was circular and appeared both simple and infinitely complex. No flags hung on the walls. Instead, data floated. Projections of entire star sectors, condensed trade flows, fleet movements, cultural migration patterns, and above them, a fine web of colorless lines that only became visible when one changed one's perspective. This was the imperial temporal framework, the synchronicity of which people in the inner systems spoke as if it were a second gravity. The delegates were not greeted with fanfare. They were greeted with time. Each arrival was scheduled within a time slot that guaranteed both security and dignity. No jostling, no unplanned encounters, no chance proximity that might spark political tension. The Thorn dynasty had learnt that the most dangerous moments in a Type 3 civilization were not the loud ones, but the uncontrolled ones. A single step in the wrong corridor, a glance taken as an insult, a gesture that in another culture was an oath. On thousands of worlds, gestures had been able to develop into weapons. Imperator Elias Thorn did not appear immediately. That was part of the choreography. Presence, they had learnt, did not mean duration. It meant weight. And weight was gained by creating moments rather than filling them. First, the High Chancellor of the Council, a man named Joran Veth, went through the admission protocols. Veth was no Thorn, but he was old enough that his biography read like a cross-section of the Empire. It was said that as a young man he had worked at a dark well, long before black holes were referred to as transformer stations in official documents. His voice was calm, and it was precisely for that reason that one heard it. "Welcome to Asterion," he said, and the word "welcome" sounded less like a courtesy and more like a statement of fact. The Galactic Council has convened because synchrony is not a given, not in a galaxy, not in an eternity. There was a murmur, consisting more of implicit translations than of sound. Many delegates wore no visible implants, yet almost everyone had some form of linguistic adaptation that translated what was said not merely into words, but into culturally compatible meanings. The Empire called it inclusion. In the Outer Rim, it was sometimes called control. The representatives of the core worlds were easy to spot. Their clothing was not ostentatious, but precise. Fabrics that reflected light only in a way deemed trustworthy. Patterns that deliberately did not emphasize regional affiliations, but rather their connection to the center. The delegates from the outer arms were different. More ornamentation, more symbolism, more visible independence, as if one had to assert one's own identity against the smooth surface of the Empire. Seated in the front row was a delegate from Nova Tarsus, an industrial world situated on a major transit route. Her face was young, yet it was well known that youth was not a measure of age in this empire. Beside her stood a transparent data cylinder in which votes and mandates were stored like frozen light. She did not look at the projections, but at the invisible lines that were only visible from a certain angle, as if she had understood that the real power lay within this network. Behind the delegates, the Citadel's chroniclers moved silently. Not journalists, not commentators, but people and machines whose task was not merely to record decisions, but also their reasons, their constraints, and their subsequent justifications. The Thorn dynasty did not archive because it was nostalgic, but because it knew that immortality preserved mistakes. In the gallery of names lay the voices of the ancestors. In the hall of nodes, the voice of the present was formed, crystallized for centuries. Joran Veth raised his hand, and the projections changed. The trade flows faded. The cultural patterns receded. What remained was a map that was not political, but physical. Gravitational fields, space-time corridors, dark zones where sensors struggled. A region on the edge of the mapped areas flickered. No red warning color, no dramatic marking, just an area that could not be neatly translated into data. "We have," said Veth, "an anomaly in the synchronization, a flicker in the imperial rhythm. It is not a failure, nor is it an attack, at least not in the language of our usual threats. It is a deviation that does not fit into the known models." A delegate from the Helix sector, whose world was renowned for its theoretical institutes, leaned forward. "An error in the quantum protocol?" Veth shook his head slowly. "The node cores are stable. The entanglement states are intact, but the correlations show patterns that did not originate with us." The word "us" hung in the air, and it was as if someone had slightly altered the temperature. Not because it openly suggested that something alien might exist, but because it hinted at the possibility that the Empire did not alone define what normality was. At that moment, Elias Thorn entered the hall. He did not arrive with an entourage that shielded him like a wall. He arrived with two people who could be interpreted as both family and power. At his side, his wife, Mara Thorn, whose gaze was so calm that it almost seemed like a promise, and behind them, a step behind, Kira Thorn, the daughter whose name had already been whispered more than once in the inner circles when talk turned to their own missions. Kira was not yet officially part of the council, yet her presence spoke volumes. The chain, it had been said, each link bore the weight. Here was a link that was already being put into position. Elias did not remain at the podium, as an emperor of old would have done. He walked along the front rows, slowly, so that every delegate could see him. Visibility as a covenant. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. The acoustics of the hall captured his voice and carried it through the air without amplifying it. No dominance through volume. "We are at a turning point," he said, and his words were a direct echo of what the Citadel itself seemed to be whispering. Not because our energy sources are faltering, not because our fleets are weaker, but because we are beginning to come up against a boundary that is not made of matter. He stood in front of the map, in front of the shimmering area. "We have learnt to manage stars. We have learnt to use dark wells without disappearing into them. We have learnt to view time as an archive. But if something touches our synchronicity without using our protocols, then that means one of two things. Either we are overlooking a truth within our own system, or there is a truth outside of us that does not ask for permission." Some delegates reacted immediately. You could see voting options lighting up in their data cylinders, security queries racing through the network in quantum pulses lasting mere seconds. Others remained silent, and that silence was often more dangerous than outrage. Silence meant someone was already calculating. Mara Thorn took half a step forward, not to interrupt Elias, but to give him a second dimension. "The Council will not vote on panic," she said. "It will vote on a course of action." Kira said nothing, yet her gaze rested on the invisible lines of the grid, as if she were seeing not the map, but what it left out. Her face bore an expression of concentration that looked less like politics and more like a mission. Anyone who knew her would have recognized something in it, a willingness to venture into the realm where the data ceased to be convenient. Elias turned back to the assembly. "We will investigate the anomaly, not with a single ship, not with a single institute, but with a coalition that combines our scientific rigor and our military discipline. We will do so with sufficient transparency that no one can claim Thorn is harboring a new power, and we will do so with sufficient rigor that no one can exploit this unrest to reignite old hostilities. There it lay, the Council's true objective, not merely to respond to a deviation, but to prevent the response itself from dividing the Empire. Rebellions were running out of steam, they had said. Yet there were forms of unrest that fueled rebellions rather than exhausting them. The sense that the center no longer had everything under control, that normality was beginning to crack. In the hall, a delegate from the outlying regions rose to her feet, her voice tinged with a culture that had less faith in smooth-running systems. "And if it is not an anomaly," she asked, "but a sign? A warning of what we have become?" Elias looked at her, not coldly, not sternly, but with that uncomfortable seriousness that had earned him his reputation. "Then," he said, "it is all the more important that we look, not away." The Hall of Knots was completely silent for a moment. One could hear the distant hum of the resonance cores deep within Asterion, that steady smoothing of energy, as if the planet itself were working to conceal the tremors. Then the Council truly began. Not with solemn oaths, but with questions that cut like knives. Who is deploying which resources? Who gets access to what data? Which fleet movements are interpreted as protection and which as a threat? And underlying it all was an unspoken but palpable concern. If the Thorn dynasty controlled normality, what would happen if normality gave back something that could not be controlled? In the coming hours, decisions would be made that would seep into the flow of the day and appear to most inhabitants of the Empire as invisible updates. New priorities, new routes, new security levels. Most would not even perceive it as an anomaly. This was how power worked in eternity. It altered reality without reality feeling dramatically different. Yet in the Citadel of Time, between the Gallery of Names and the Hall of Nodes, the unease was no longer just a whisper. It had been given a place, a map, a flicker on the edge of understanding. And Elias Thorn, Emperor of a galaxy, knew that the most dangerous boundaries were those one could not see until one had crossed them.